While you were playing with your fabric, we did a couple little housekeeping things. One, there was a request for those images that were the different layout variations. So we posted those illustrations to the quiltalong page and
on our website.
So if you go to our website, quiltalongs, friends all around, you'll see it there. And
we put it in a grid. I'll be posting it later this afternoon on social media, just a grid of all of the images. I just didn't want to do 8 different ones because that becomes too much.
And the other thing, if anyone missed the earlier live stream, we edited that and posted it to our YouTube channel, which even though it's available here on Facebook has a much lower resolution. So our YouTube channel will have this morning's, the 9 a.m. live stream up. It's up already.
So there will be, if you missed the first 2 parts, the first part was a live stream. The second part was a pre-recorded video showing how to piece the curves. And then this is the third and last part of our little quilt-along.
Yeah, and this discussion we're having right now will be edited or uploaded to our YouTube channel after we finish. So anyway, welcome back.
Yes, and let us know if you have any questions from the video that you watched on the piecing of the curves.
And it's kind of insane. You've all been watching it. I just looked cumulatively, you've already watched 30 hours of that video. so it's getting viewed.
So one of the tips that I think you might find helpful, especially with scrappy quilts, because if you're using the same fabrics and the same placement in a quilt, you're not worrying about what ends up next to what. However, in scrappy quilts, you really want to make sure that you don't have, like we took down the quilt so we could talk about the quilting, but you don't want to have, for example, this fabric next to, I guess it would be over here, in this position. You don't want to, there's certain times you don't want what we call like awkward adjacencies. So you don't want to have,
hold this for you.
Yes, thank you. You don't want to have this fabric appear next to this fabric or up here. And the easiest way to lay out scrappy quilts is to make 75% about of the blocks, lay them out, and then custom make those last 25%. Because what that does is allow you to see, like, do you need more blue in this section? Do you need more orange in this section?
Or a couple more plaids.
Exactly. So, I think it's over making hundreds and hundreds of quilts at this point. We've sort of decided that this 25% is kind of it's the most efficient way to make sure that you can lay out the quilt and then not have to rip out certain things because you need a green in that position or whatever. So
and I know it's a little contrary. There are a lot of people who say, what I do is I make lots of extra blocks and I don't use them all. If you want to do that, by all means do that. We just we kind of like for us it's a little less wasteful of our fabric and our time to custom make and really tailor that last bit rather than just say, oh, if I have 20% extra, something's going to work.
And I don't want to sew a bunch of blocks I don't use for the most part, after the auditioning phase. And Dina, we agree with you. There's never too much plaid. That's absolutely agreed upon. So there are a couple of options in terms of quilting, and we'll show you what we did with the quilting, and we'll talk about thread color, and we'll talk about various options and how the quilting can really change the quilt. And especially when it comes to scrappy quilts, the quilting I think is really important because you've got a lot going on in terms of the color and in the pattern, and so you don't want to fight with that.
And I want to take a moment here to talk about our first live stream and this. Yes, we are helping you make the Friends All Around quilt, but we're trying to talk about some larger design decisions that you make. So what we're about to discuss in terms of quilting also really relates to other quilts. And I think I'd like to start from a distance. So you notice we took this down. It had been behind us for the first live stream. We took it down so we can show you some close-ups. But what I want you to see from where you are, I'm far enough back that you can't really tell what the quilting is, most likely. What you notice...
The pattern. And it's done with a pale gray thread.
And yeah, this is pale gray, a medium gray. And you might wonder, like, what was the quilting pattern they used? And what really matters here is the texture. And we talk a lot about how we're going to quilt every quilt. And with this one, we decided there is so much going on in terms of fabric, the patterns of the fabric, the different colors, the different values, the different saturations. We wanted the quilting to provide an all-over texture without creating an additional layer of design that would be distracting. And so a lot of people would look at this pattern and say, oh, look at the arcs. I'm going to echo quilt. I'm going to do parallel kind of concentric circles with all of those arcs. That could work and it could be beautiful. We just decided that we didn't necessarily want to isolate those arc forms further, that we felt they were graphic enough, and we wanted the whole quilt to read as kind of an overall piece rather than semicircles laid on a field.
So can I just interject? Yeah. So this is a time to, this is the perfect example of why we don't recommend stitch in the ditch, is that and I know a lot of people that's like, before they do anything, they feel that they need to stabilize all the blocks, they need to stitch everything in the ditch. You're welcome to do that if you like that technique, that's totally fine. What we're looking at when we're thinking about quilting is we're looking at a whole different design layer. So we're looking at the piecing and the patterns that's made by the piecing. And then we're looking at a whole layer that goes on top of that. We're not, the seams don't matter so much to us. What we're trying to do is look at the shapes and the forms. And for example, stitching in the ditch down the middle of these arcs would reinforce the differences, not unite them. So if you want this form to be more read as one, like I would really encourage you not to stitch in the ditch for
down
this particular,
the center of that, yeah.
But down the center of this, or even in these blocks, because you're going to take something that's supposed to be one big unit and you're going to chop it up a lot, and and you're going to create a lot of
like walls.
Yeah, you're going to create a lot of lines that are going to be distracting from the big gesture you spent so much time making. So we're looking for an all over, texture, not emphasizing.
So if I get up really close to this, you can see in a light gray thread, there are what look like kind of not quite concentric petal shapes. This is all done completely freehand. And the idea is that it's a somewhat dense but not rigid quilting pattern that doesn't have any straight lines. So it overlaps all of these arc forms and
the seams between the blocks.
seams. So as you back up, you don't see the quilting as a unique shape. we know ahead of time that we're going to always wash and dry our quilts, and we know that we use all cotton batting, so they're going to shrink about 3-4% and have a lovely pucker. And this was a quilt pattern that would give a very even pucker across the entire quilt without calling additional attention to any specific shapes.
So, there was a question about suggestions for quilting designs that work on a domestic machine. We often recommend like a wavy pattern that works on a domestic machine. A wavy grid works on a domestic machine. Stippling works on a domestic machine. This kind of dahlia pattern also is very friendly for a domestic machine because you're just working a small area at a time.
As long as you can drop your feed dogs in free motion quilt
For this pattern. Yeah.
You're fine. If you have a machine on which you can't drop your feed dogs, you could do just straight horizontal lines across the whole quilt with a walking foot. Very simple. We wouldn't encourage, well, actually, let me back up. Let's talk about the density of quilting. And this is something that comes up with every single quilt we or you make. How close together do you want those lines of quilting? If you look at this, the quilting in this it creates shapes that are somewhat, I'm going to say, between 1/4 and 1/2 inch apart. And what that does is it means that there are no big unquilted areas. And more importantly, there are no unquilted areas that are as large as the width of any of the arcs.
And the differences between each of the units is really consistent. And that is what we're talking about with a design layer, that rather than having big straight lines that you would get with Stitch in the Ditch that reinforce the shapes of the blocks, you're getting just this small texture that doesn't have to compete with all of this, pattern busyness going on. And you don't need more patterns created by the shadows of the quilting. So every time there's, a line of quilting, you're getting a shadow. And what we're trying to do is keep the focus on these shapes. And so we want a smaller texture in the quilting, so this doesn't get overwhelmed and there isn't competition with a whole bunch of big straight lines that are going to make it choppy looking.
And once again, it goes back to intentionality, that you could take a completely different approach than we did. And you could say, as a maximalist quilt, I want to be maximalist in my quilting. And you might choose to have 15 different quilting patterns. You could go like over the top, but this is what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
You could do it, but would you see it? If you think about Victorian crazy quilts, they were very maximalist for kind of cultural reasons. They were often used as a way for women to show their domestic skills and their collections of fabrics. So they often had expensive silks and velvets. And they were often hand embroidered in a way that would be a kind of a sampler of...
And there were scraps.
So
there were odd shapes.
But the embroidery that was often done on them was done with heavier embroidery thread that you could clearly see.
Right.
If you go all flamboyant on the quilting and you have these flamboyant patterns, it's going to be hard to see that quilting. Now, with solids, you see the quilting a lot more clearly. But, it's always the intention. We decided the maximalism for us is in the plethora of patterns, and that called for simple quilting.
And, Nancy's saying like she would have to do a stipple to get that texture. A stipple would be absolutely fine for this quilt.
I don't know why people badmouth stippling.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of people apologize saying like, I'm sorry, I only stippled this quilt. Like, stippling can be awesome.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's not that easy. So stippling is often about restraint and understanding that you're trying to highlight the piecing and not necessarily the quilting. So don't ever be apologetic, in my opinion, for stippling. It's absolutely a great way to finish a lot of quilts.
So let's talk about thread color, because I know with multicolored quilts like this with a lot of pattern,
I'm actually going to get somewhere you talk.
Okay, great. It can be confusing to figure out what thread color is going to work the best. There are a lot of people who would suggest that you use a multicolored thread for what is it called? Variegated thread. But we find that the variegated threads are really hard to control, and it can end up looking a little messy sometimes, especially when there's lots of colors. So again, because you're going for one layer, and the variegated is just hard to control.
And I think I'll be a little more explicit in my feeling about variegated threads. I think people often, if someone has a quilt that has, let's say, orange, blue, and green in it, they might buy a variegated thread that's orange, green, and blue, thinking it matches. But the problem is you don't control where those parts of color show up. So the orange thread, the orange part of the thread may show up on the blue and then disappear on the orange.
Yeah.
And what happens is it can get blotchy, because in your desire to match the fabrics, you actually introduced this weird uncertainty. So that's why we often look at a quilt like this, and we look for a thread that is both a hue that will disappear. Gray is extremely neutral, so it often works, but also a value. Here we have lights, and we don't have super light, but we also go fairly dark. So we definitely don't want light gray, because it will read as pure white on the darkest of the fabric. And can you hold this for a second? So I actually have if I hold this cone up and I put it next to,
and because people are going to ask, we use signature
Tex 40.
Tex 40, 100% cotton thread, and we refer to it as decanting it onto our bobbins for piecing as well. So we use this thread for everything. We don't have a gig with them. Nobody's paying us to tell you that. We just like this thread, and this is the most economical.
Yeah, we don't buy the fancy expensive threads.
No.
This is a slightly darker gray than the one we use. But the reason I'm holding it up is if I hold it up here, for many people, it will look so much darker than the lightest fabric. But if I pull a single strand of it on top, it's actually going to pretty much disappear. Yeah. It's going to be very forgiving. However, if I pulled a light thread, it would look like a streak of white. Now,
can I answer a question though? There's a question about, is this a good quilt to practice stippling? This is a great, if you're doing a scrappy version, this is a great quilt. If you're doing it all in solids, that's going to show a lot more. But if you're using kind of a similar vibe of prints that we're using, because you're really, you got to get really close. You can't even see the quilting really, because actually, there's so much distraction.
So here's the good news and bad news. Practicing, it is so visually busy that as you stipple, you will occasionally get lost, and you might cross over something you've already quilted. That's the bad news. The good news is when you do that, no one's going to see it because it's so visually busy. So
I think though,
forgiving.
I think that you can control that by sort of just stippling a block at a time and moving forward.
Yeah.
So you're
or just making sure, don't just work within the block, cross over a little bit.
And can we show that up close? And this is, I know this is kind of heresy in the quilting world. Look, we're crossing over the seams because we're not interested in creating more kind of division between those seams. We're crossing over, so the quilting is very, it's acting as one layer over the whole thing. It's not, this is one block, this is one block, this is one block. We're trying to unify the whole thing.
And even though we used medium gray, can you hold that for me? My arm's getting sore there. We have also a lot of neutral threads that have names like baguette and wheat and mother goose. And these are generally, or camel, these are often great to look at too. If I put in, this is probably the darkest fabric. And again, on screen, you can barely see it. It disappears on the lights.
Closer.
Yeah, well, I don't kind of want them to see it. Like, it's maybe a little light in value, but what I want you to remember is when you quilt, especially if you're like us and you're using cotton batting that's going to get washed, that fabric is going in a valley, or that thread is, quilting thread is going in a valley that's going to have a slight shadow. You're never going to see it laying on top of the quilt. It's always going to be slightly darker and in shadow. So quilters are always told, don't look at the thread on the spool, look at a single strand. And we always say, don't just look at a single strand, look at a sample of a single strand quilted, because it's going to appear darker.
A lot of it's too going to depend on the batting that you use, and because if you're going to use a poly mixed batting, you're not going to get as much shadow because you don't get as much crinkle. This is 100%. And where some natural light is coming in to our studio right now, so you can see that it's a little bit more texture than it was earlier in the morning before the natural light came in. So if you are one of those people who is using a super thick loft of a polyester batting that's dense, you're going to not see as much texture with your quilts. And if you're somebody who's going to use 100% cotton, you're going to see more. If you're using a high loft wool or something like that, you're not going to see as much crinkle in this either. So a lot of it will also be a factor in which batting you use. And speaking of which, if you have issue 15 that this quilt was in, there's a great article on batting. Where did it go? Here it is. There's a great article on batting, and we tested 6 different types of batting, quilted 6 quilts the exact same way, all with different batting. So you can read all about that.
And there are a couple questions in the chat about warm versus cool colors. Color is very personal. I don't ever want to say that there's a benefit to warm or cool. It's like, you've got to figure out what's your quilt about and how does the quilting thread work with it. There are warm and cool colors. There's everything in this quilt. I think that I love the tan with it. It does have a natural warmth to it. And that to me is less about the fabrics than about the vibe of the whole quilt. We wanted this to feel kind of like an old friend.
Yeah.
Especially because all these fabrics have memories.
It's not an old friend. It's like a new, cool, hip friend who's familiar and easygoing.
That's true. Someone you've never met before, but you feel like you've known them for years.
Yeah. But there is a cool vibe here,
There definitely is.
There's a question about how do we choose the size of the quilting pattern?
Like the density of the quilting.
Yeah, and so quilting for us is about drape and the texture, this design layer we're talking about, that we're trying to have this uniform kind of density to the quilting, so it provides a uniform texture. We're not fans so much of when we see quilting patterns that use teddy bears or something like that, because then you get these big awkward negative spaces between the teddy bears.
Or like the tummy of the teddy bear is this big unquilted area that makes a circular form that competes. So
we tend to go a little bit smaller, typically most of our quilting is less than an inch between stitching stitching
Yeah.
lines.
And it's often relative to the thickness. So if this, I can't remember, when this is finished, that looks like it's about, what, 1.25 inches?
Yeah.
We don't want any areas this big unquilted. So a general rule of thumb might be that we look for the smallest size of piecing and make sure that when it's quilted, no matter how the quilting falls, it'll be
It's not poofy.
flattened. It won't be poofy. So it might be, if this is 1.25 inches, the quilting is at least half or even maybe 3 times as small as that. Just for
It's kind of also
rule of thumb.
a reverse engineering of what we want the drape to be.
Oh, let's talk
Because
about
the drape is really critical to us, because we're not making these all as art quilts that are going to be in some gallery or something.
I mean, this one does hang on the wall, but we still, when Weeks was saying we want it to feel like a hip friend,
Yeah.
we didn't want it to
Putting this
look
one
like.
on me, or you?
What? Oh, you can put it on.
Oh, okay. So this is what we're looking for in a quilt, and this is for any quilt, and even we're looking
That
for
looks
this.
good on you.
Yeah, it would make a great coat. I'd love to make a coat with this.
You're
We're
not cutting
looking
it up.
for no, we're not. We're not. We're looking for a nice drape, and that drape, if you go smaller, if you do matchstick quilting or something, it's going to be very stiff, and it's not going to have this nice drape.
And I know most people know the term, but matchstick quilting is when you have parallel lines of quilting that are about the width apart of matchsticks, so maybe 1/8 of an inch. It makes for a very flat, very rigid, stiff, and I think often scratchy quilt. It can be appropriate for a piece of wall art, but definitely...
Quilt show judges love it.
Quilt show judges love it, unless we're the judges, which we rarely do. I'm not a fan. I'm a huge fan of people's technical abilities to do it. It's really often masterfully done. I just don't necessarily agree with, like, it doesn't make a quilt that I want to curl up with, and I'm a functional kind of guy.
I think you know what, it made me a little sad that it's kind of become the default for many people, and they've forgotten about drape, and they've forgotten about using quilts for functional purposes.
Yeah.
And that I think is the is kind of
little wall pieces. It can be
it's just
fantastic.
appropriate for that.
Yeah.
So
Kinda old.
let's also talk about binding. We used one of our, this was from our vintage line, this little dominoes. It's a little domino, very small, kind of retro inspired.
Gray on gray.
Gray on gray, because it's dark and it creates a little frame around the whole thing.
And because we didn't use a gray like this as any of the backgrounds, so we knew that it would be adjacent to dozens and dozens of different fabrics. We did not use it anywhere else in the quilt, so that wherever it falls, it provides a clear edge. If we had picked, let's say, if we had picked this cranberry red for the binding, we have several different cranberry blocks, and it would just look like there would be suddenly a gap.
Yeah.
So yeah, we wanted
small scale neutral binding is a really good way to make everything kind of look nicely framed. We did not, as is the case most of the time, we did not put a border on. We in general find that borders are the least interesting part of a quilt, and sometimes they water down the effect of the piecing, because even if it's like a 4-inch border or a 3-inch border, it cumulatively, it's a lot of area for the quilt. And so if you want to make it bigger, just
make more blocks.
Make more blocks, because it really does look nice to have the design go all the way to the edge, as opposed to just have a lot of blank space around.
And you may have noticed too, let me go, okay, here, every other row ends in a half row, which in design is called engaging the edge, that your mind imagines it continuing. It just cuts it right in the middle. And that lets you imagine the pattern going on and on and on.
So there's a question about, could we see the backing?
Oh.
This is our manicule
Okay, vocabulary
print.
word of the day.
I love this print.
So if
you see the little finger that was used in kind of old time graphics.
So the mana, if you're into Latin, you get the hand.
Yeah, that's our manicule.
So that
print.
little pointer finger is known in typography and printmaking as a manicule.
Because then you can see the quilting a little bit more too.
Oh, there.
Yeah, there we go. That's a really good way to see the quilting. So again, you're looking for, you get a nicer drape when you see that consistent all over pattern on the back as well. The backing, in this particular case, we wanted something that was darker. And because this is such an eclectic bunch of prints, the kind of fun playfulness of the manicule motif on the back seemed like the absolute, it really married kind of the feed sack prints and the batiks and the plaids, and this is such a,
it was a diplomatic choice.
Everything but the kitchen sink.
Another thing, since this is about finishing, I'm sitting here with slightly tired shoulders because this quilt is somewhat heavy. We used a slightly heavier cotton batting in this, and most of the quilts we make with a very thin cotton batting. Sometimes when we're doing pieces that we know will be used as functional quilts and we need more warmth, we go heavier. But also for wall hangings, one of the things I like with a slightly heavier batting is it doesn't blow in the wind.
Yeah.
It's very stable. Acoustically, that added bit of cotton gives it great acoustic properties, and it'll just make a room sound better. And then, of course, you get a little more loft. And I think we both wanted the texture to be super important. Now, if you go too heavy, then you get stronger shadows in the quilting. We didn't want it. It's like
See, I think when you get fewer shadows because it's so dense. If you get with a super thick batting.
Oh, but then it shrinks so much more, so the valleys get deeper. So it's like, it's.
So I'm also going to give you one very odd sounding tip that is what we do on every single quilt, which is that, and again, we're not getting into the whole pre-washing argument because you do whatever you want, but we pre-wash everything. We sew it, we piece it, we quilt it, and bind it, and then we throw the whole thing in the washer and dryer again because the batting hasn't been pre-shrunk at that point, and we're trying to get the texture. When we pull it out of the dryer, we don't like leave it there. And go.
That's what we do with our clothes.
Yeah. We're there when the alarm goes off that the cycle is done. We pull it out. We take it over to our ironing board. We crank up the steam function on the iron, and we give the whole thing a really good press. And I know this sounds odd, and you might think, oh, but you've just gotten all that texture in there, and then you're gonna take it all out when you press it. But that's not what happens. What happens, especially when you have all of that steam in the iron, is all of the big wrinkles fall out and the little wrinkles remain. The little crinkles remain. But it's basically what we kind of think of as a modern way of blocking a quilt, because you are just taking you're relaxing all of the big wrinkles that came into the quilt in the drying process, and then just the small crinkle layer remains. So it looks very neat, and it looks very graphic, and it's really critical because we have to photograph everything, for social media and our publications and everything. But that is the way to get a very, very neat looking, but still textured quilt for photography, or if you're doing a guild show or something like that, or submitting a quilt to hang in a show. I really encourage almost just, we typically, because we're using cotton thread, the iron is actually touching the quilt, and it's just like a quick iron with a ton of steam over it. You could even just hang it and steam it as well, but we'd rather have it flat. So it's going to remain very, very stable.
Right, and a couple of you are asking, basically, do we press or simply steam by hovering? And we do generally press. We don't want to push so hard that it gets flat. So it's kind of a light pressing while heavily steaming. Now,
it's got the batting in it at this point, so it's not like ironing a shirt that you're gonna.
No.
If you go across it, you're gonna get a wrinkle.
And we also press from the center out, because a quilt this size, and I forget the finished size of this, but with a heavy batting like this, she can look it up. With a heavy batting like this, that steaming and pressing process will add 1 to 2 inches.
56.5 by 56.5 is our version.
I'd say it probably loses or will regain at least an inch or an inch and a half in each direction if you press it out of the dryer. Now, if you make it out of solids, sometimes you might consider using a press cloth. Depends on your iron, depends on your water, depends on your fabric, but sometimes pressing a finished quilt will overly flatten or leave a bit of sheen around seams that is distracting. That rarely happens, but you can test a little area, and if that's going to happen, you can use just a clean press cloth before you do it, just to avoid any of that.
So, and back to just pressing in general, I think it was in our New Day quiltalong,
put it on now.
Or summer camp maybe, that we found that a lot of people were stretching. They were talking about their triangles stretching or something. And I remember, because we've taught thousands of people at this point, and I have seen people in workshops, in person, back when we did in-person workshops. Here's their ironing board, and they would take because they were pressing to the side, they would do this very strong motion this way.
Very directional.
And they would, instead of going down, which is what we do, they use the iron to push the fabric. That, even if you want to press to the side, I'd really encourage you to finger press, use your finger to get the seam allowances to the side, but press down.
Whether you're doing the side or open.
This is ironing, and this is pressing. And
you can really distort fabrics.
You can really distort fabrics doing that. And so,
be a little gentle. Sorry.
Especially with these curved pieces, I would really encourage you to rethink the physics of taking especially steam and a hot iron on a big curved piece like that. If you're one of these people who uses the iron to push the seams over, you're going to get distortions. So after this comes out of the dryer, we can do that because all of the layers are all sewn together. There's batting in there to stabilize it, and that's one thing. But in general, with pressing, down is your friend.
Very different.
Sure.
While
really
piecing
different.
Versus when the quilt is done.
Exactly.
And also, some of you may have a large design wall, and you may actually just pin Oops, it's getting heavy. You may actually pin it to block it on your design wall if you wish. There are so many ways, and steam it. There are many ways to do this. And again, it depends on what your quilting is, what your batting is, what your objective is when it's all done. There are countless ways of doing this. So if you haven't thought about it, you might experiment, see what you like, and it's supposed to be an enjoyable process here.
So Patricia has a kind of random question that we will answer, which is she can't figure out how we took the secret agent photo.
Oh, it's a secret.
So we're sort of winding up anyway, so we'll sort of tell this story. The photos are really important, and they're evocative to all of our social media and our events, and they just give a whole mood. And so we were racking our brains trying to figure out what that final photo was going to be. And we decided we had a couple of different things like walls we were thinking about. And
spaces. Yeah,
and so we decided to walk our dog.
When in doubt, walk the dog.
Around our little village and see if there was anything that just struck us. And this kind of goes back, for those of you who've heard me talk about Twyla Tharp's creativity kind of approach, which is showing up, making time, and focusing, like putting everything else aside and saying, I'm going to use this time to see if I can come up with an answer. It isn't just like expecting that it's going to happen while you're making dishes or doing dishes or, doing laundry or, driving to get your oil changed. It's like you want to kind of really create space in your brain, space in your day to like think through some options. So we thought we're going to walk around for like an hour and see if anything comes up, because we had some options that were just, because of the weather and the time of year, they just weren't ideal. And so we decided to go up onto the commuter rail station in our town that we live on the village that borders the city of Chicago. And so there's a commuter rail that goes into the city. And I had this idea that we could stand up, hold the quilt on the platform with the city in the background, that might look cool. And
because you can see straight down to the skyscrapers. It's a beautiful view.
It really is. And then we were like, okay, that's an option. And then there were a couple of other different views up. The commuter rail is elevated where we are. So just different perspectives. We thought about standing up on the train platform and getting our drone up to take it across the train platform.
And we went up to the platform.
Yeah.
We took
with a dog.
With a dog. We took a whole series of shots. For every shot that you see, there are so many that you don't.
There's 50 options that we've auditioned that you never see.
So we've got all these shots, and we decided
So then Bill was going to go up a different way, and we each separately found a tunnel that went up a back way to the other side of the train tracks.
Kind of creepy tunnel.
And I'm like, oh,
this is it.
This is it. This is the creepy. This is the bunker.
And not only that, but if you look at the secret agent photo, you'll see there was even overhead lighting that looked like an interrogation lamp.
Yeah.
That was the lighting. It was a very narrow tunnel.
Yeah.
Beautifully sized for the secret agent quilt. And we both instantly knew. We had separated, but we both saw it and we're like, this is it. This is the shot.
I had taken a picture on my phone and he had taken a picture on his phone, and then we kind of met back up.
And we're like, this.
We both got it. And but the question of like, how did you hang it? We didn't hang it.
This is the catch.
Because in public spaces like that, you can't hang it. So what we did was take the photo and frame it of exactly the angle we wanted with that light coming down. And then we took a flat shot of the quilt.
Lit in the exact same way.
Yeah,
so
that,
we needed light to match, the scale is exact, and then
we just dropped it in Photoshop.
And it's like not just drop, it's really a ton of work, because you've got to get it very realistic there and moody. And we don't use Photoshop to alter the quilts at all, but there are times like this where like, this is the shot we want. We can't block access to the train platform. This is how we're going to do it. And it was interesting because when our daughter was coming over to our house that night for dinner, and we showed her the shot, and she immediately knew. She said, "I hate that tunnel." She's
so creepy. That
she said it's so creepy coming back like at 1 o'clock in the morning from downtown and going down that long tunnel. She's like, "It's perfect."
So one thing I do want to say, because we brought up Photoshop, is that we use Photoshop to be able to show you detail, to be able to sometimes. There's the lighting is tricky, and we need to be able to even out the lighting. But we never use Photoshop. We never use anybody else's images. I think that's.
And we never use it to change. Like if a seam doesn't line up perfectly, I'm not changing that in Photoshop. It's a quilt.
We're not changing that.
But
we used
we use it for storytelling.
We use some silly pictures of Sean Connery or whatever, Diana Rigg for Secret Agent. But in all of the photos that you see in all of our publications and all of our social media, those are photos we took. And the way that we use Photoshop is typically to make it clearer for you to be able to see certain details.
Right, and I think often it's to communicate the design intention, to help tell a story, to help inspire people. We're not ever using it to deceive anyone. For me, it's just a tool. And actually, the more if you've spent time with Photoshop, it's far easier to take a good photo than it is to try to fix a bad photo.
Yeah.
And we're really lucky that we both have photography backgrounds. Weeks is an incredible stylist. That's I'm terrible at that. She's a great stylist. So she will think of ideas together. She'll do the styling. We'll work on the lighting together, framing the photo, and then anything that has to be done in post-production to fix any small issues we do in Photoshop.
Are you doing Photoshop?
I do in Photoshop.
Yeah. I know Photoshop, but he is so much better at it. So, do I know where it came out? Well, that's kind of why I felt like I had to.
Oh, yeah.
We had to explain our, how we use Photoshop, because there are a lot of people who, and there's a lot of the quilting industry that has turned to this artificial AI, like the quilts aren't real, the rooms aren't real. And, I really want to make it's important to us that authenticity is important to us, that we want you to know that we're actually taking those photos. They're our photos, and they're real photos, and they're not AI. And because I feel like I don't want to be selling you something that's fake.
No, it's just I have no interest in that. And I will absolutely be the first to say that I will use Photoshop to get color balances right. If there's an overly dark corner and I know someone wants to see a detail, I can kind of lighten that up a bit. But it's a tool to communicate the intended design and not to deceive and not to be. It's definitely not a shortcut. It's more work.
But for example, the background for the summer camp, our final quilt, that was shot in Charleston, South Carolina, that wall. And we weren't in Charleston, South Carolina, you know, we took that photo
of that wall. How many years ago?
Must have been like 6 years ago.
I have a collection of photos of walls that we have taken over decades that sometimes we need a quilt on a wall. I would prefer to hang it. You can't easily hang a quilt on a stucco wall, but if you get someone's permission to photograph their stucco wall, and with the right Photoshop, you can get all the lighting to match. And so we're going to use it for the textural or the color purposes. But you know, that's it. It's definitely a balance, and it's fun.
Okay. All right. So, do you all have any other questions about the Friends All Around quilt? And
that was a tangent.
Yeah, that's what we're hearing. But you know, I think people.
It's good to know.
I think it is helpful to know. The other thing to share while you're thinking about whether you have any other questions is this little event we've had this morning is going to be a blueprint for us for future morning mini quiltalongs, to be able to not just give you a pattern, but to be able to take you through some of the steps for patterns in the future that we think lend themselves to a design discussion that might be helpful to you. So
whether you're making blocks or an entire quilt, please post your progress on the Modern Quilt Studio Patterns and Fabrics page. We can't wait to see what you all do. Unfortunately, we can't give design advice and feedback on everything. We'll occasionally comment, but please don't ever take it personally if you don't hear from us. There are two of us and thousands of you. And,
there's about 33,000 customers. And so I know a lot of people, you know, I know you're busy, and it's like, I really can't read them all. So the Patterns and Fabrics group is a great place because we can check in on there periodically. But email is great for customer transactions, but we can't provide feedback for design issues and that kind of thing. So let's see, let's just answer a few last ones. Maureen wants to know about whether we use starch. We don't use starch. If you like starch, feel free to use starch. Occasionally with yarn dyes, we use Best Press because they're a little bit looser.
But we rarely.
I don't think we used any starch. I don't think we used any starch for anything in this quilt.
No, and if it works for you, if it makes it better, absolutely use it.
Absolutely. Let's see. Where should quilt blocks and quilts be posted? On the Modern Quilt Studio Patterns and Fabrics group. That's a great place.
So it's a subgroup.
So what we're trying to do with that group is create a place where people can be working on different patterns and different quilt-alongs all at the same time, because life just isn't that compartmentalized, and there are lots of people who are just starting Secret Agent like today, you know, who just ordered the quilt pattern this morning, for example. And then there are lots of people who had fun at Secret Agent, they just discovered us, and now they're going back and they're doing the other quilt-alongs. So we'd like to just have that page be a really vibrant center for you to go and see what cool things somebody is making, that's a pattern that we made, or, you know, using fabrics we designed. So post everything there because that's the best way to do it. Let's see. Just hold on. The 75% rule. Just to repeat that quickly. If you're making a scrappy quilt, rather than making, and it needs 100 blocks, rather than making all 100, make 75% of them, lay them out, and then make that last 25% according to what is needed. Like if you need, what color is needed, what print is needed, what fabric is needed where, because sometimes you end up, just the layout requires that you need certain colors or certain fabrics in certain places in the quilt, and it's a lot easier to custom make those last 25% of the blocks than it is to have to rip out and substitute fabrics or whatever.
And I'm going to say really quickly, one last thing, because we were talking about this. This was the styled shot for the Friends All Around quilt in Modern Quilts Illustrated 15. And this is an example where that quilt is hanging on that wall above that little bench. The only way we use Photoshop here is the wall is actually a little, it's more of a cream, but we wanted to show off the colors and we didn't want the bright wall to distract. So we darkened the wall in Photoshop, but it's actually hanging there on that wall. Everything is unchanged except for the color of the wall, which helps you see the quilt.
Exactly. So we will see you next, I think, on April 1st.
Oh, for Quilts First.
For Quilts First. So that's in a couple of weeks.
And we have lots of surprises. We have lots in store.
So much ahead. So we're gonna be working on the put the finishing touches on future events that are coming your way, and
this live stream right now, we're going to go put it up on YouTube. There are a lot of steps to get there, so it'll take an hour or so. It'll be up there, so you'll have all three parts: the 9 a.m., the 11 a.m., and the pre-recorded sewing tutorial. Take a look at that all, and we really, really appreciate you taking time.
I want to say one more thing.
Oh, you want to say more?
So
okay.
We're going to be talking about it in the next month or so, but just to give you a heads up so you can plan your sewing and your kind of events. May 15th is our 25th anniversary at Modern Quilt Studio, and that is a really long time for a couple to work together.
We've made some quilts.
25 years of modern quilting on May 15th. So from May through May 20 of 2024 through May of 2025, we're going to have all kinds of special things going on.
We're going to celebrate our anniversary for a full year.
Yes, and we're going to celebrate it with you, and there's going to be a lot of things that we're only going to do this 1 year. So if you haven't...
And we don't want to tell you anymore because we'll be just exhausted naming them.
So if you have not subscribed to our newsletter, which we've gotten so even too overwhelmed to send out a newsletter, subscribe to the newsletter and make sure that you are following us on this page, because the Patterns and Fabrics group is great for people sharing their projects. General announcements, events, and that kind of thing. That's all going to be happening here and in our newsletter and our website and that kind of thing. So there is a lot headed your way. So make sure that you've signed up for that.
Okay.
And okay, I think everybody's set.
We've got work to do.
Yes, we've got work to do, and they've got work to do.
You've got quilts to make. So thank you all for joining us. Happy National or International Quilting Day, whichever it is.
Exactly.
And
we'll see you on April 1st.
See you real soon. Take care, everyone.